Hi, year 13. This is your support for the extract question which says, analyze, evaluate and compare the arguments for and against the view the US presidency is imperial. As we know, the imperial interpretation comes from Schlesinger from the 1970s, when he suggested that perhaps the examples of FDR through the New Deal and then Second World War, plus Lyndon Johnson with the Vietnam War, and then the concerns of Watergate with Richard Nixon, had implied that the presidency had moved beyond congressional constraints, and oversight wasn't as effective as it would have been in the past. And there was great dangers that perhaps this was the way the presidency was going to be. And I suppose our question is whether or not his view of the 1970s still holds water in a more modern context when we look at the different presidents that have happened since then. So, what should you do in preparation for this extract question? Well, definitely read the textbook, Theories of Presidential Power, page 152 onwards, because what that does is it implicates not only what Schlesinger puts forward in terms of the imperial argument, but also the challenging arguments to this. The view, the classic seminal work of Neustadt, which has been that the president is only having the power to persuade and therefore is essentially highly constrained in their work. And also that of Skarnek, who puts forward the view that actually the constitutional powers are pretty significant. So what you want to do is you want to read this beforehand, get a good firm understanding of what it is, where the interpretations are, and then move on to look at the arguments. Here's argument one. Okay, we're arguing that the president can be seen as imperial. And the assertion would be that the president can exploit their constitutional powers due to limited effective congressional oversight. So the constitutional powers are what? Well, you would explain the role as chief executive, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat and chief recruiting officer, and consider how potentially powerful those can be. If you consider the chief executive with the size and power of the federal bureaucracy, that was certainly exploited by FDR, and you could argue by George W. Bush with the emergence of the Homeland Security. In terms of commander-in-chief, you have the role of Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War. You can talk also about the role of George W. Bush with his preemption policy. In terms of chief diplomat and chief recruiting officer, well, even Trump could be argued to be using his constitutional powers to really shape the nature of the political system. With his appointments, he put in with the Supreme Court, leaving an echo chamber of his philosophy within that particular court. So there is capacity for significant power, especially in foreign affairs, if the Congress is less willing to challenge. However, there's a classic argument against that, saying that in fact the president can't be imperial and could be argued to be truly constrained. This is what Wadden puts forward when he says there's a mismatch between what can be expected and what can be reasonably delivered. So when you look at the list of congressional constraints, they're quite significant ones. And what you would want to do is you want to outline some of those related to particular presidents. So if you look at, for example, George Bush Sr., we're talking about restrictions in terms of his budget policy. Clinton faced the same issues as well, trying to get a budget through a Republican Congress. Then you can look at domestic policies that you want to pass forward. Trump's wall, Obama's healthcare plan, Clinton's healthcare plan, all good examples of this. And both Clinton and Trump were restricted through impeachments that they had to face, which certainly derailed their presidencies over a period of time. So, although Dumbrell puts forward the view that perhaps we talk about an imperial Congress, that's probably a sign that Congress does have the capacity, if it's assertive, to really put obstacles in the place of any particular president. And that's probably been enhanced by partisanship too. Contrasting that argument is to say, well, there are signs that there can be the potential for a president to work beyond Congress if the circumstances are right. And they try to exploit different informal powers over time. For example, executive orders have been used by all three of the presidents pictured here. George W. Bush as a means of trying to push through policies that he struggled to get through Congress. Same with Trump in terms of immigration, although he faced challenges from the Supreme Court. And as we know, Biden has put forward numerous executive orders at the start of his presidency to really set the agenda without having to go through Congress. We know the executive agreements have increased significantly since the 1960s, but what we've also seen is signing staples, ways of shaping legislation, which are used by George W. Bush and by Obama. And George W. Bush and Obama have used recess appointments as another means of trying to shape their executive without congressional oversight. So there are definitely ways in which there's been an accession of power which can be exploited by presidents at particular times, certainly in the short term. Contrasting to that, I suppose, is the whole remit of different challenges that the president can face. Interest groups, such as shown by Clinton and Obama, such as pharmaceutical groups, in terms of the healthcare plans, show how difficult it can be for presidents to actually push through any legislation. Then they face an incessant media, the problems of trying to control their federal bureaucracy, and actually the divergent views of state governors, all of which mean that the president's authority can be undermined. You consider into that the variables that they can also undermine them. The fact that Obama came in an economic slump, which made it difficult for him to set the agenda. You can look again at all sorts of different problems that can be created, such as Trump's COVID problems, political scandals, and also Supreme Court cases which can undermine a president's authority. And you can definitely put forward the view that power and authority can be reduced. And to say that they're imperial is probably to ignore the difficulties that any president can face in a 4 or 8 year term. So what's your judgment? Is the president imperial or imperiled? Do you agree with Mervyn that if actually the imperial presidency is just a cliche, a stereotype, which ignores the range of difficulties that they face? He argues instead for a bargainer-in-chief. Ta-Nehisi even puts forward the view that the imperial presidency is not a useful idea. It just doesn't show the nuance that can exist within the president's power and authority. Or do you take the view that actually imperial presidency has potential, and crisis situations such as 9/11 can make presidents more powerful because Congress is less likely to challenge them as a result? These are the things to consider when you put together your conclusion to this extract. Okay, good luck with this.